Hey team, Macho Models here, and I wanted to come back to the enduring conversation that I've had about primer. So I don't know if any of you guys have had just awful experience with primer, but my initial modeling journey was quite trying. So I was working with some of the Vallejo stuff, and some people messaged me. I think I was mixing that wrong. I was also working with some splash stuff. I tried some other types of primer, but I could just never get it to consistently come out of my airbrush right. And then for this last series with the Tallgeese, I've really gotten into the Mr. Finishing Surfacer, the 1500 series, and it's been absolutely phenomenal. And I just wanted to do a quick run through about how that works and how I spec out my process. And hopefully that will save you guys some time, and maybe you can kind of pick up some tips and tricks. Another big thing too that I never really realized with working with primers. So early on, I was just kind of the school that I didn't really need primer. I would just shoot straight onto the plastic. However, once I got more into doing modifications, so cleaning up seam lines, doing some heavy sanding, if you put paint straight onto sanded plastic, sometimes you're going to see that come through. Now, depending on your stance on the model, like if you want it to be more of like a 3-foot or 5-foot model where you're not looking at it that close, sure, it probably doesn't matter. But when you want it, really exact and absolutely right, putting a primer on there to be able to fill in those little seams and those of the sanding areas is important, and it definitely shows within your work. And I'm happy that I found this Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500, because I think it does a phenomenal job. So let's say you're working with whatever model and you've done an extensive amount of sanding on it, and still you can kind of, if you look at the plastic part up close, you're going to be able to see the scratch lines and the groove lines. Well, putting 1500 in there will most of the time help eliminate a lot of those scratch lines, and it definitely shows after the fact once you put your paint over top of that and you get a really nice clean finish. And then hopefully you kind of see that reflected throughout my work. But I wanted to go again and just kind of show you how I set up primer and how I step through it, and then maybe you can use this in your process, or give me some feedback and maybe there's some better ways that I can go about it. So I'm going to hit pause and I'll come back and I'll show you how I mix all this stuff. Okay, and we're back and we're ready to start mixing. So for this, I've got my Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500. I've got my graduated no-name cap, and then I have my Mr. Color leveling thinner in my little hot dog bottle right here. And then you can see I'm using for my pointer, instead of my little spray gun pen, I have this Badger airbrush mixer. So this is just a little electric mixer. I like doing this a lot to save the threads. So when you shake up a primer, you shake up any of these glass bottles, what happens is, you can even see this a little bit, that the threads start to get corroded. So the so what there is that if you want to hang on to this stuff for a while, as you keep mixing it, you can see all this crust and everything builds up around there. That starts to break the seal. So effectively, you kind of like cut down the shelf life on it. So I like using this little mixer versus shaking it and putting ball bearings is what I used to do. And I found pretty good results with this. The only pickle is that you have to remember when you're working with a lacquer based, you can't put water on this. So typically I've got this little water jar that I dunk in for all of my acrylic stuff. But for this, after I mix it, you have to use alcohol to clean it. So simply put, I drop this in here and then I start mixing. And then another trick that I picked up is just kind of kicking it along the edges. And as this is mixing, one part that'll save you a lot of cleanup is that I leave it on the entire time, and then I slowly raise it so it flicks the remainder of the primer on the edges, versus if you stop it and then pull it out, it's going to be a lot soupier. So I'll put this off to the side, and I'm going to clean this off camera just for the sake of brevity. Part two is I take my pipette. So again, these are just no-name ones that I got on Spray Gunner. They're super cheap. And I'm going to drop it in here depressed and pull up a little primer. And for this one, we're just going to shoot for 2.5, since I'm actually not going to be spraying with this. So I fill up the cup until it gets to about 2.5 right there. And then for anybody who's curious, this is actually just a little soap holder. I think my wife got this at the grocery store. I've got a bunch of them for my pipettes and brushes as they dry. And then I'm going to take my Mr. Color leveling thinner. And as I mentioned in other videos, I'm going for a 1-to-1 ratio. And admittedly, I probably didn't know what the heck that meant, so I'm glad I'm doing this video when I first started modeling. I'm going to go ahead and fill this up to about 5. So if you remember when we first started, I shot the first piece here to about 2.5. Let's see if we can see that. And then I put in just enough primer so that it reaches over the 5 line. And to mix this, all I do, and I picked this up from Duke's Models, is I'm just gonna go ahead and suck some of it through and then push it back in. And then I just repeat that, maybe give it a quick stir, but I just circulate it through the pipette. And then once it's got a pretty good consistency, all I'm looking for here, it might not show up on camera, is that maybe you can see some of these little swirl marks right here. I want to get those to go away the best I can. Now, they're going to go away completely? Probably not, but with just some thorough mixing, I can kind of reduce it. And you'll always hear this too in modeling, and it's absolutely true. What I'm going for is the consistency of milk. So you guys can see this stuff is quite watery. And watery is good, especially when you're working with your airbrush. Watery means that it's going to spray a lot easier out of your airbrush. And as I've mentioned in some of my other videos, it's going to also mean that your cleanup's going to be a heck of a lot easier. So what you're looking at now is effectively a properly mixed primer. And that's the process right there. I know it might seem simple, but it took me probably 6 months, 3 months to experiment and to come here. So I'm hoping some of you who have maybe had trouble with primer or have not really thought about primer, or you know what, there's also like a big contingent of people out there that I know that only spray primer out of cans and they don't do it out of their airbrush. I think that might be partially motivated by some of the frustrations that I've expressed earlier with working with primer. Needless to say, I hope you guys found this process interesting. And if you guys have any comments on how I did it, if there's a better way to do it or how you do it, I'd love to hear about that. I always really dig hearing about how people get after their process. And again, with all this stuff, you can find it on Spray Gunner. It's all hung out right there, and 10% off if you use my discount code MACHO. I hope you guys dig it, and remember, whenever you guys are getting after your builds, be sure to make it macho.